Yes, I think we're going live. Okay, yeah, I think we're live now. Oh, Vinakavakalevu. Okay, Vinakavakalevu, everybody, for logging in today. Okay, okay, so Vinakavakalevu to all our listeners from the United States, Japan, yes, Fiji. I'm just going through the list here. Dr. Julie, New Zealand, Bulavinaka Silo, Master Le, oh, Mongolia.
Wow.
We have a couple of Fijians, Dr. Julie, who are teaching in Mongolia. And we have lots of friends here in the United States. So, Bulavinaka, everybody, Vinaka Vakalevu for taking your time to come and listen to me and Dr. Julie. Lalu Vina tau Tomasin Bosilao. Oh, Vinaka. Okay. Okay, so I think we'll make a start. And I think at this point, just like to acknowledge you, Dr. Julie, for taking your time away from your family on a Saturday evening. Wanted to say Vinakwa on behalf of all our listeners from around the world, as I've just mentioned a few countries that I've seen online. So, and you look so beautiful. You look like Marama ni Nanronga.
Got my chamba in Singatoka town.
Oh, nakabaliw. So to our Tauhu from Sigatoka, Dr. Julie bought her chamba from the beautiful town of Sigatoka.
Oh.
So nakabakaliw, Dr. Julie. So I think, well, first of all, as we've already done our Talanoa, I think it was last year around September when we did our interview, and the video has been watched by so many of our Fijian families all around the world. I think a video has been watched over 1,000 times.
Wow.
So it's really, so and I'm just so happy, Dr. Julie, that we can provide a platform like this free of charge to our families in Nadroga Navoha and those of Nadroga Navoha origin all over the world. So many of them are listening to our Talanoa today. And Dr. Julie, you in the last Talanoa, we encouraged a few of our listeners to tell them, hey, if you want to ask questions, please send them to me. And we did. So we're so happy. So we level to our Taubu from Nadroga, who kindly sent not one, not two, not even three, but more than 5 questions.
I know.
And so maybe, do you think we could use this question, Dr. Julie, to set the scene for our Talanoa today?
Yeah.
So maybe before we start answering the questions and talking to our listeners, would you like to greet our listeners who are watching right now?
Yeah, Vinakwa Tarisi. Yes, to all of the people that are watching, thank you for joining us. Vinakavaka Levu. It's very nice to speak to everyone and to have a community that would like to have Talanoa about all the ancient things that are in the Singatoka Valley. So I'm very pleased to have you join us.
Dr. Julie. And for our listeners, some of you may have just joined us for the first time today. Dr. Julie is a professor at the Ohio State University, and it's actually located on the East Coast of the United States. So maybe some of you may be wondering why we're doing this live at 12 midday Fiji time. It's just the fact that you are 7 hours difference with Dr. Julie. So it's actually 7 p.m. In Ohio right now on a Saturday. And this is 12 midday in Fiji on a Sunday, Dr. Julia. So some of our listeners may be having their beautiful lunch right now because it's lunchtime in Fiji. So Vinaka Vakelevu, to our listeners, you can bring your plate of ika, vakalolo, yondalo, tapioca. I'm sure they look so yummy to come and listen. Is there a particular food that you really enjoyed, Dr. Julie, when you were in Fiji?
Vundi.
Wow.
Vundi. I love vundi. I like dalo. I like tave. Tave with vundi and prawn curry.
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds so delicious.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned, Dr. Julie, that you have a student of yours at the Ohio State University who's doing research in looking at the tave, the river mussels. Would you like to just share a little bit about that particular research?
So she is my my student. She's doing her master's thesis, and she's writing her thesis now. Her name's Samantha, and she has analyzed all of the tave shells that I excavated back in 2001 and 2002. So all of the fortifications in Nadroga and Nabosa, they have shells on the ground all around where the yavu are. And the people used to go and get, just like they do now, they would go down to the river and collect the river mussel and then carrying it back up to the mountains and then eat them. And there's layers and layers of them. So I have directed her to do an analysis of the size of the shell, because I'm interested in understanding if in the past when people would go, you know how they go down to the river and they get into the water up to their neck, the ladies will be down there and you'll see their heads like sticking out and they use their feet to pull the neck of the little clam. They catch it with their toes and they'll kick behind them and they'll grab it and then they put it in the bag and they'll fill up a whole sack. And they'll go and spend the whole day there collecting the river mussels. And sometimes they're very small, and then sometimes they get the big ones. The way it works with all harvesting is that the harder you harvest, the more likely you're going to catch all the big ones, and there's only the little ones left. So I'm having her do analyses of the sizes to see if in the past they were bigger, or if they got smaller because people were using them so much that, you know, they caught them all to the point where there were only little ones. So she's doing that analysis right now. And I don't have the results yet, so I can't tell you, but there were really big ones. And so just like when Lapita people arrived in Fiji and they first got to the island, all of the marine mollusks that they would get off the reef were really big, enormous ones. And when they did excavations like at down at Singatoka sand dunes and other places, the size of the shells was enormous. It looked like like a rugby ball. Yeah, because they had never been picked before. Yeah, so it's just trying to understand how did people use those tabe in the past. So she's working on it. And so she has a pair of calipers and she's measuring them. And there's thousands of them. So very slow. But we'll find out.
Okay. Wow. And is she enjoying her analysis thus far, Samantha?
She is. We were going to go to Fiji last July, but we weren't able to go. Originally, we were going to go to the market and purchase the tabe that they sell in the heaps at the market and measure the modern ones to see how big are the ones that people are catching today, so we could compare the modern ones with the ancient ones. But we weren't able to go.
So you never know when the border opens. You'll go.
Well, in the future.
Okay.
But we've heard other people tell us that some seasons the tabe are big, and sometimes I've heard other people say when they've come to visit Singatoka and we bought a bag of tabe from the ladies down by the river, they open the bag and they're like, "Whoa, these are big ones. We never get these in Suva." Because I think people catch them more, And so there are only the
Yeah.
little ones left.
Absolutely. Wow. So this is interesting, for those of you who are listening in and maybe wondering what a tave is. So I think in the Mbawan language, it is the kai, yeah? Kai niwenran. Kai. And so tave is the Nadroga dialect, Dr. Julie?
I think so. Or West, it's Western anyway.
The Western, Western.
Yeah.
And in terms of looking at the sizes, talking about sizes, what has been like one of the largest size that you have seen from one of your excavations?
They'd probably be maybe about 4 inches, maybe 4 inches, or about 10 centimeters wide, which is pretty big.
It's pretty big.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because today they seem like they're more about 3. So when you see them in the little heap at the market, they're usually about 3, maybe. Right. So they were bigger. And, it's just because there were less people catching them.
That's right.
So they could grow bigger because they grow as they keep growing. They never, fish and mollusks just keep growing. They don't stop. Wow. So if they live a long time, then it's a really big one.
Man,
yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. And I know our women in, Nadroga, along the Singatoka River, they very creative with the recipes. I have some of my my own favorites too. But now I notice that a lot of our Fijian women are very creative, very innovative in coming up with different styles of cooking the kai. For me, usually when I was little, I remember the kai being boiled. So it's usually the boiled kai is what I was used to, with a slice of onions and, all those little yummy things that go in the pot. But now, even in hotels, it's kind of done in such a way where it's so beautiful to look at. Looks like a work of art that's even hard for you to eat it. Wow. Because they look so beautiful. And they normally keep the shell and then cut them up and have it boiled and already cooked inside the shell. So,
yeah.
Wow.
And the shell it's a beautiful colored shell. It's kind of a dark color with purple. Yes. It's very bright colors. So I'm sure they make it look amazing.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Oh, that is wonderful. And yeah, we wish Samantha all the very best with her studies. And if you go to Fiji eventually, I'm sure, some of the our listeners, our audiences would love to catch up with you and Samantha, maybe at the Singatoka market.
Maybe. Yeah, I hope we go. I do.
You never know, eh? All right. Level, Dr. Julie. So maybe we'll go straight into one of the first questions. Here we want to acknowledge Master Vereniki Nalio. Master Vereniki, Venandu Master, for sending in your questions to Dr. Julie. So the first question that Master Vereniki asked Dr. Julie, the first one, did she find any similarities and differences in those historical caves and fortifications in terms of scientific evidence that you collected? So yeah, so it's a little bit of a comparative analysis there between the historical caves and the forts.
Okay. So I think he means the archaeology, not the geology.
That's right.
So there are many caves in Fiji, and in the Singatoka Valley, there are quite a few. And in 2001, I did excavations at Tutumba, which is in Navosa. It's just near Sawene village. And that particular cave had been used in the historic period. And so there were, it was occupied, it had a wall built across the front. And when muskets were first brought into Fiji, that was a place where some muskets were stored and traded. And the Namataku Yawusa, which was originally from Nandi, I believe, they came in with a lot of muskets and they kept them there. And so then when sort of in the colonial period, things got a bit heated, there was a couple different attacks on that cave, and the people hid inside. And the wall that was built in the front of it sort of protected them. And I think there was some muskets that got fired at the front of the cave. And then the back of the cave, there's a hole at the back and you can pop out on the mountain above. There's a tunnel and you can come out. And I think they threw some burning branches and things down those holes. So in that particular cave, when I did excavations there were some pieces of bottle glass, and then some pieces of wood that were probably not very old, that might have been from that historic period. But the excavations down into the deposits of that cave came across a fire hearth that had fish bone in it, and parts of a pot. And the charcoal in that hearth, I radiocarbon dated to, it was to AD 1300. So that's 700 years ago when someone made that fire in that cave. And then further deeper in those deposits, there were burned shells from toto, and I'm not sure what the Bowen word for that is, but toto.
I think that's is it the candle nut? Eh?
Candle nut, yeah, candle nut.
Like, I think
There were
lauthi or sikevi.
Sikevi,
yeah.
Yeah. And there were burned candle nuts that were burned by people, most likely, because they would burn them to make a little light. And those were in the bottom, and those were 2,000 years old. And that was really the bottom of that cave. So that particular place, it's a big cave, and it's filled with guano. So people probably went in there and stayed in there and used the space, for shelter. Maybe during cyclone or when they were having conflict, they would, use that as a refuge and maybe store the yams inside, because it was dry and they could store, the yams. When people would harvest them, you could stack them up, like wood, and store them. So that cave probably had a very long history of use, all the way up into the historic period. Wow. The other cave that I excavated is Nahehe. And Nahehe is about halfway up the Singatoka River. It's right at the border between Nadroga and Navoha. It's at the edge of the Nangalamari limestone outcrop. And it's a cave that sort of goes in to the side of a large hill. And there's a pool of water and the ceiling gets very low and you have to duck down through, and then you pop out and you're in a much larger chamber. And probably in the past, you weren't able to enter the larger chamber because if the water was high, you couldn't go through. You could have swum through, but you wouldn't have known that it was there, because in the old days, you only had a torch with fire. There's no way you could have gone underwater, with your torch, so you wouldn't have known it was there. So inside that cave, there's an enormous chamber. And then there are banks of sediment inside. And in 2017, I went with my graduate student, Kyle Reardon, and we excavated in the sediment inside that cave. And that cave had charcoal bands in the sediment that were probably from fires that had been lit in there. And we found some little stones that were probably sue, the pot stands, some little stones. And then we excavated another part of the cave that was closer to the entrance, and there was a small hearth there with ash. And the radiocarbon dates from that smaller hearth came out to 1600 years ago, so about 200 AD, so quite old. And we did some microfossil analysis of the sediments in those hearths. And there were calcium oxalate crystals, which are from taro leaves. So probably that was a lovo. And when you burned the leaves, the little crystals inside those, the things that make you scratchy in your throat, when you eat dalo leaves, if you don't cook it enough, those little crystals are in there and they'll make your throat scratchy. So when you take the fresh leaf and you wrap with it and you cook it, the crystals fall out into the ash. And they're so small you would never see them, but you can see them with a microscope. And they were in the ash. So probably that was a lovo that was, almost 2,000 years ago. So that particular cave is kind of a wet cave, and it has, a little stream that comes out, and it seems like people used it for a refuge at different times, but they didn't really live in there because it was very wet and not a place that would be very comfortable to live. So I think the caves, probably had multiple uses where people would use them for shelter and for storage and for refuge during conflict. and then probably for ceremonies, for religious ceremonies, and then also for burial. And they would bury people's remains in those caves because the sediment of the guano is very loose and you can just dig right into it. And at Tutumba, it mixed in the deposits were bits of human bone and mat. And the mat was wrapped around the bone. And so that was a very decayed burial in the deposit. And there probably were other ones there. But so, you know, they used them for a lot of things, and they were important places. And, you know, there were stories and names for all of them. And we've barely scratched the surface on those caves. There's a lot of them. Yeah.
And it's very interesting when you mentioned that some of these caves have names. So when you're talking to some of the local villagers, were they familiar with some of the names of some of those places and caves?
They were. They knew them. There's stories about them. And, you know, I think some of the stories only, you know, some families know the stories and not everybody does. And so I wouldn't always, it depended who I was talking to.
Yes.
And sometimes they would tell me and sometimes they wouldn't, but there were just little pieces of stories about the caves.
Wow, very interesting. Thank you so much, Dr. Julie, for sharing about the cave, because I remember in 1994, yeah, I think 1994, when we went there as a student from USP, when we went to Sawene. And I think when we returned to Suva, one of the villagers actually brought in a long kuro, a kurumbala. So when you were mentioning it the last time we had our Talanoa, that was the memory I had, and now it's kept at the Fiji Museum. So I was really happy that they were aware of the safety of the kuro. Apparently a few young boys, you know, wanted to be adventurous and entered the cave. I'm not sure, I think it was Tatumba, because Tatumba is the closest to Sawene.
Yeah.
And they brought it was really kind of, you know, intact. It wasn't broken, and so now it's in the safekeeping of the Fiji Museum.
Yeah, I did. There was a lot of pottery that came out of the excavations of Tutumba. There was an excavation at Tutumba in 1972 by Bruce Palmer, Fergus Clooney, and Colinio Mode. And I think Bruce Palmer died not too much time after that excavation, and so none of that was ever published. And the notes of the excavation are at the Fiji Museum. And so I had a chance to read the notes. They collected some marine shell and other things in their excavations, but I'm not sure whatever happened to them. And I did some inquiries at the Fiji Museum, and, you know, it's a long time ago now. I mean, I was born in 1972, so no one knows where those things went. They're not in New Zealand, not sure what happened to them. So when I did my excavations, I had the old notes from 1972 and tried to compare, you know, what they had found, what they had written about, and what I had found. And that particular vessel form, the kurumbolavu, that is sort of, to that part of Fiji, it's kind of the style of pottery that's from that area. And there are fragments of kurumbolavu in the upper levels of Tutumba. So it probably is something that within the last 500 years became sort of a style, a regional style around that area. And when people would cook with it, you know, because you lay it on its side, right, when you cook. And so it would give you this really long tunnel, right, for cooking. And they must have had something special they were putting in there. I just don't know what it was. I figure they cooked a really long yam inside. I don't know what they cooked in there, but they had something special because the pot has to be long, and I'm not sure what they were doing. It'd be interesting to find out what the stories are about why that has to be a long pot. I don't know.
Yeah, because I'm more used to seeing the globular ones. Yeah. That's the one that is common in Kandavu, eh?
Yeah. So
ones.
I'm curious. Someone must know the secret. I don't know why.
Maybe, some of our listeners may have some stories. Maybe, hey, what do you think, Dr. Julie?
I hope so.
And yeah, if they know or remember any of the stories of the Kurumbalam, so it's more elongated,
Mhm.
it's more long kuro. You can send us a message, and that'll be nice for us to share the comparison between the globular pots, the kuro bakaviti, and those Kurumbalam, the long kuro. Wow, man, this is amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Julie, for the two caves, Tatumba and Nahehe. Okay, so that's wonderful. And I think for those of our listeners wanting to ask any questions, please feel free to also type it down in the comment section, and we'll be happy to go in and find out what your questions are. So we'll start off with Master Veronique. So I'll ask you the second one, Dr. Julie.
Okay.
Okay, so the second one here, what were some unique features of the limestone found in these caves? So it's really good. It's connected to the caves. Up the Sinatoka Valley, mostly on the east bank of the Sinatoka Valley, that were peculiar to Fijian archaeology, according to your research, analysis, and findings.
Okay. So by limestone, like the limestone formations in the cave, you think?
Yeah, looks like, yeah.
Okay. So so the Nangalamari limestone, if you go up the road, either side, Sinatoka Valley Road, you come to this very large cliff, and it's high. It's very high and smooth, and there are caves riddled within that formation, and I don't think anyone has explored them all. I know Trevor Worthy, who's an Australian. He's a specialist in fossils, like fossil birds and fossil lizards and things. He went and did a little bit of poking around in some of the caves, just looking in to see if he could find the fossils of bats or other things. And he did just a little bit of that in that particular formation. When I did excavations in 2002, there's a village at the foot of Nangalamari called Tawatawan, and above Tawatawan is an old hill fort called Goro Goro Vakatini. And Goro Goro Vakatini is on the top, and it's inside a sinkhole. So you have to climb up the cliff, and there's a worn spot where you have to kind of hold on with your fingers, and you go through a crack, and you end up inside this. It would be like you were inside a cave that had the ceiling caved in. You're inside a big sinkhole, and inside that sinkhole, which is sort of like a natural, fort, were lots of yavu. And then at the back of it was a stone wall that they had built to block anyone coming from behind. On the other side of the stone wall was a very big hole, and I mean like maybe a 2 meter by 2 meter round hole, and you can see a stream of water will occasionally flow into the hole, and it just goes down. And we took a pebble and we threw a pebble in the hole, and we could hear it falling and falling and falling. It gave me a nightmare because it was so deep. So that is probably a cave that just goes straight down into the core of that mountain and goes way down there. And I am sure there are all kinds of fossils of Fijian extinct birds and extinct lizards and other things that are down there. So hopefully someday someone who is a biologist will go down and maybe get on ropes and like rappel down inside there, because I'm sure there's all kinds of things down there. So the limestone, the water percolates through the limestone and it carves it away, and it creates all kinds of tunnels and caves, and I'm sure there are many places in that formation that no one has ever visited. And they make stalactites, which are kind of these sparkly, glittery things that hang down, and they're really quite spectacular and beautiful. And there's a tour company, I think it's Singatoka River Safari, that has tourists go and visit Nahe'e, a couple times a week. because it's relatively close to Singatoka and they go and visit it. So that cave actually gets quite a few tourists that go see it. But I'm not sure if, Fijian schools go and see it. I would wish that they would, just to see the cave. It would be exciting to see it because they are very impressive, very large, and you really get a sense of sort of the natural history of Fiji when you see these caves. So Tatumba is also a big cave. It has a couple spots where you have to go through a very small tunnel. And you might remember this, Terry. You see, there's a place in that cave where you have to crawl through a very small hole. And it's very dark and very tight and very frightening. And I've been there through it a couple times and thought this is terrifying because it's so small and dark. But then you come out and you're inside a big chamber and there's a very sparkly, almost like a boulder that has sparkly crystals on it. There's all kinds of incredible things in there. So I'd say, a geological tour of Fiji would be an incredible thing for everyone to do because there's some really amazing, geological formations. And then, there are other small caves that have deposits in them that are archaeological, where people have left all kinds of, things, and they're really haven't been investigated at all. So Fiji has a lot of them. I think it will keep people busy for decades if they wanted to do that.
Wow, no, that's amazing. And I'm glad you mentioned Dr. Trevor Worthy, yeah? Trevor Worthy, who is a paleontologist, who specializes in fossils. And yeah, I remembered we went into some of the caves just opposite, just behind the Singatoka sand dunes, next to Voli village, which is kind of opposite where the Singatoka sand dunes visitor center is. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's quite terrifying, to go into caves, especially when you don't know what's inside and it's very dark. And sometimes you don't know what's on the other side if there's only a few of you working. But if you're working as a team, should be okay.
When we did the excavations in Naihe'e in 2017, that's the first time I really had done excavations inside a very dark cave where there was no light other than our headlamps. And it was very strange because it was very dark. Other than what you had on your headlamp, there was no light. And we couldn't tell what time it was because, there was no connection to the sun or the outside world. It was very surreal. And the sounds would bounce around in there. The sounds of dripping water would echo. It was very, very surreal. I still have a lot of sort of like sometimes dreams about how dark it was. Very dark.
Oh, wow. Man, amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Julie, for sharing that. And I think you made a good point where maybe schools in Fiji, should take the opportunity to, even teachers, those of you who are listening in, to take our children to be part of some kind of adventure. If they have caves behind the school or next to where they live, this could be an opportunity, particularly in the case of Singatoka, for our school young ones to actually go and be part of the geological study of their place.
Yeah.
Wow. Yes, valuable, Dr. Julie. I'll go to the next question, if that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good? Okay. So the third question asked, in her research, was there scientific evidence, anthropological stroke archaeological, that explains bats' presence? I think you mentioned it a little bit earlier on in terms of the guano in the limestone cave as their habitat at the time of your research.
Okay.
So
there's different bats in Fiji. There's the flying fox, Becca and
Bowen,
Becca. And those are the ones that hang from the trees, and they in the daytime they hang upside down and make noises, and there are usually a bunch of them, and they usually have a tree that they like and they're a colony and they hang around, and then at night of course they take off and they fly around and they go eat your bananas and your papayas and all of that. So that's the flying fox. So they don't go in the cave at all. Then there are another kind of a bat, and I think it's McDonaldi. I can't remember the Latin name for it, but there's a Fijian bat that would hang out in caves, and they're actually very rare now. I'm not even sure where there are anymore, but in the journal entries from the 1860s and 70s, there were cave bats recorded for Tutumba, and they were there. And there are bones of some of those bats in Naihe'e, but there aren't any living colonies anymore. And I don't think there may not be one at Tutumba anymore. And I think people have scared them, and they've moved away. So there probably are other colonies elsewhere, but they're not very common. The bulk of the guano that's in the caves that is there now is from a bird called a swift, that is a little cave bird that flies really fast. And if you ever go to these caves, they dart in and out so quickly that you're not even sure you saw it. It's this very sort of dark blue and black bird. And it's just very, very quick. And so they fly in and out of the cave and poop, and that makes the guano. And then there is also another bat that eats pollen and insects, and that's a very small bat. And those ones sometimes are in the caves. So the deposits of guano today farmers, at least when I was doing field work, would go up to the caves with a flour sack, and they'd fill it up with guano, and they'd take it back down and use it for fertilizer. And I was like, horrified, because I was like, please don't dig up the archaeology. But I was like, well, they have to do their work and they need their farming materials. I understand. But, they would go get it. But the guano is quite deep because it's been collecting for thousands of years. And so when I excavated Tutumba, it was 3 meters of guano. It's way down there. And the guano is acidic. So, as water percolates through it, the acids in the guano actually eat away at the limestone and will decay the limestone. So, the bottom of the cave is filled with a lot of rubble because the guano actually has broken down the bottom of the cave itself. So there's an incredible biology of caves and bats and guano, and I'm sure a person could study that, and learn all about it. But the living bat colonies, I think the ones that were really rare are even more rare than they used to be. So I don't know if anyone is studying them. The person that I know that knows about them would be Dick Watling, who studies birds and has done consultant work and written some books about birds in Fiji, but he also knows about bats. And I'm not sure if anyone is doing any studies of them right now. I would hope so, because they are really rare. I would hope so.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, Dick has written quite a lot of books, and I think he was also involved in the research for the Kavauningau, the bird that is unique only on the island of Ngau in Lomaipiti. The petrel, Fiji petrel. Yeah. Wow. Man, look, I think for many of you who are listening in from Veitalanoa with Dr. Julie, this is providing some really good research topics. I think for our young Fijians out there who are, into the natural sciences, this can be a good opportunity to study about Mbeka or Mbekwa in the Nadroga dialect, and learning more about birds, and support the amazing work that Dick Watling is doing in Fiji. He's doing amazing work for so long, for so many years, Dr. Julia. Wow, well done.
One thing is that, nowadays, I think people they're not as aware of the native birds as much as they used to, because I think, with farming and people relying on their garden products, they don't eat those birds much anymore. But when the first Fijians arrived in Fiji, there were a lot of birds. And the birds didn't know what people were. And there were many flightless ones as well that, would have just stood there. And when people first arrived, they would have discovered an island that had all kinds of animals on it that they could eat. And they would, just pick them up. You could just pick up, there were petrel colonies up above Namosi, there were petrel colonies up there. There they would lay their eggs on the ground, and the birds would fly out to sea. And all of them are gone now, but they were an important part of what people used to live on back in the old days. There were even this very large beetle that made a grub that would dig in the wood, and there was a Domo Domo article about these beetle grubs that people used to eat that no one really eats anymore. But it's a beetle that's like the biggest beetle in the world that grows in Fiji, and it's a big one. It's really big, and it makes a larva that in the olden days people used to collect and eat. Yeah.
That's interesting. That reminds me, I think in Namosi, they call it yavato. Yavato. So it's kind of like is it a pupa stage? Yeah. So yeah, it's actually one of their delicacies over there in Namosi. So I will mention it to Kali Wunindilo about Yavato. So I'm sure some of our listeners from Namosi listening in will know that we're talking about what we often joke about it to them, because that's like their number one of the top food in the food chain back in the day. Wow.
It's very ancient, it's something that goes way back, way back.
Wow.
When people first arrived in Fiji and they didn't have their gardens, what did they eat? So there was either the reef and the fishes, and then all the stuff in the land. And those traditions are really old. So they shouldn't be embarrassed, because they're really actually a part of, the culture everyone used to have.
Yes, exactly. Wow, thank you. Man, this is really interesting. I'm just, yeah. Can I ask you one more question? Are you okay with time?
I have plenty of time. You can keep asking. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, Vinaka. And thank you for the listeners. There's still many listening in. Vinaka Vakalevu, for your patience. And I know Dr. Julie's such a wonderful storyteller, and you make the story come alive with the way you describe things, my sister. Thank you so much. So now back to Master Veronique's question. This is question 4. So during her research, was there scientific evidence on the effect of the Volo War left behind in the limestone caves or hill forts? So I think you kind of a little bit mentioned it when you were talking about Tatumba. Anything you want to add to that in terms of the Volo War?
So for your listeners, the ones that maybe aren't as familiar, that refers to 1875, when the colonial government was in conflict with the people who lived up in the mountains, who didn't sign any kind of agreement as to being governed, and were rebels, right? They wanted to govern themselves, which they had traditionally, and when the chiefs that were from the eastern side, sort of said, why can't all of you guys just get along? The chiefs in the west said, this is our land, and we're in charge here, basically. So there was a dispute. So that little war was when the colonial government came in to try and make the rebels come down from their fortifications and be Christians. And so they invaded in a couple different routes. They came up the Singatoka River. There was another force that came through Nandi and then came around to the headwaters of the Singatoka, and they sort of came, at each other. And there were a couple chiefs that were sort of the leaders, and then their followers, and they went up in their old fortifications and used them just as they always had as refuges. And so one of the accounts that I read was about the siege of 2 fortifications. One was called Korovatuma and one was called Bukusia. In May of 1875, Gordon and his troops laid siege to both of those. And these 2 fortifications are kind of maybe about a 30-minute drive up on the eastern side of the Singatoka River by the village of Rewonga. And so when they did the siege in 1875, they thought that in the morning they would have a battle. So they woke up in the morning, Gordon and his troops, and they realized that the fort seemed very, very quiet. And they crept up and realized that no one was there, that the rebel leader, his name was Mundu. Mundu and his followers left in the middle of the night. They bugged out, and they probably went north up to Nangalamari. They went that way. So Gordon went to Korovatuma and to Bukusia, and there was no one home. And so the village was there, but there was nobody left, except one older woman who he called a sorceress, but I'm not sure that she was. I think she couldn't walk, and she got left behind. So Gordon burned both of those fortifications on, I think, the 15th of May, because their policy was to get everyone to move down to the river and not keep the fortifications anymore. So he burned both of them. So then in 2001, when I did excavations at Korovatuma and also at Bukusia, the only things that I would say would probably be dating back to that date of May 15th, because we knew the forts had been burned down on May 15th, 1875. So that was when they were destroyed. So the only thing that could relate back to that exact day or that date was the remains of a whale's tooth necklace that was scattered all over the ground. When we started to clear the grass away to do an excavation, we just started to cut the grass so that we could put a 1 by 1 meter excavation unit on the top of a yavu at Bukusia. And I pulled up an object that I thought might be the horn from a cow, because it was shaped like a cow's horn. And then I found another one. I was like, what are these things? And then I found another one. And then I looked to my workers who had come with me, and I said, could this be a tambua? And why I didn't recognize it is because it was black. It was completely black, like ink. And what it had been a necklace called a waseka seka. It's the whale's tooth necklace that's the full tooth. And it had the tooth had a hole drilled in the end. And probably that necklace had been hanging up in the bure. And when Gordon burned it down, it burned. And fell all over the ground. And so all of the teeth were black from the fire. And, there wasn't anything white. They were just, deep, dark black. It was bizarre to see black tambua. And so there were 30 of those just scattered all over the ground. So the necklace must have been hanging up, how people hang them up, and it just fell. So that probably is from that day when that village was burned. And that necklace, I haven't been able to radiocarbon date it because the ivory, the teeth of the whale, could be very old, because people keep tambua. And so that whale could have died a really long time ago, and all of those, that necklace could have been in belonged to a family for a really long time. So I never have tried to radiocarbon date it. But it's just a fascinating object in and of itself. I've been wanting to return it, but the problem is you can't just take whale's tooth to Fiji anymore, because people use it for weddings and funerals, and you can't just take it on the plane. So I have to get a special permit to return it, and that's something I'm going to do at some point, because even though it's been burned, it still counts as whale's tooth. So I need a special permit to return it. Which I'd like to do, because I think it could make a really interesting museum exhibit, because we could have Gordon's diary from the day he burned that village, and the map of the village, and then there's the necklace, that probably got burned on the day, which would be a really great, historical piece, right, from that event. So that's probably the one thing I think that archaeologically is from that era. We also excavated by Naihe'e Cave at a little not a taro patch, but a farmer's field that was called Garangara. And we found a musket ball, a lead musket ball that someone had, shot out of their musket long ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, that's interesting. Man, this is amazing. I'm sure if Master Nalio is listening in, he will be smiling because you have answered his questions really, really well. And even the listeners who are listening in are really appreciative of just the way you explain it very simply. And I'm sure our friends and families from Navosa and the Singatoko Valley will say their appreciation that we're able to talk about what you actually saw, and what you actually excavated and, experienced there. So it's not really you telling us what you read, but you actually sharing some of the actual work that you did and what you saw too. I find that Taumbe or the Wasekaseka, very interesting. And I'm sure the Fiji Museum, we can talk to them to see if we can do an exhibit.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I think a great one. Yeah.
Yes.
I think I don't know how much people learn about that period in Fijian history. The journal that Gordon wrote, he took all of his journal notes and wrote a book that's called Letters and Notes. I think it's called Letters and Notes, which is a very boring title. Letters and Notes in I think something the Highland Devils. I can't remember exactly, but it's a very boring title. But I found the book on Google Books on the internet. And if anyone goes to my research website, I have a link to the book. So if you want to read that book, it's a very long book. And it's all of the journal entries from that time period where he went to all kinds of fortifications and described them. They talk about the war and, how they went different places, and it's very historically very interesting, and it's on Google. You can just read it right on your screen because it's a rare book. I mean, the only other time I've seen that book, there's a copy in the Fiji Museum in the archives, and there's probably some other copies in the archive in Suva. But it's not a book you're going to find somewhere, but it's on the internet. So if anyone wants to read it, you can find it on my research page.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Julie, for highlighting that. And I think Dr. Robert Nicole has highlighted about the disturbed history in his thesis, and he turned it into a book. So a lot of Fijians now, particularly from the Nadroga Navosa region, as well as those from Ra, those from the interior of Levu, they're very, very interested in many of these resistance war stories. So we really, I'm really glad that you mentioned about that book. So those of our colleagues who are listening in can be able to find those books and start reading them. I think that's something that we're going to learn from this COVID-19, that, we're trying to encourage through this platform, Dr. Julie, to encourage our people to go back to reading. The more we read, the more we are, well informed on any particular topic that you're interested in. And I'm glad that the month of January, we're focused on Nadroga Navosa province, Dr. Julie. Yeah. Okay, so that's the question about the Volo War. So many of you who want to know more about the Volo War, we're hoping to host Dr. Robert Nicole maybe next month or in March, who will be joining in as well, just like you, Dr. Julie, to share about the Volo War, this one in particular, the 1875 one. That's something that
I'll listen in on that one for sure.
Okay.
It's not at midnight.
Yeah, we'll make sure the time goes well with yours. I'll do that. I'll make sure I'll consider your time in Ohio. Okay, so this is the second last question. And it talks about, I'll read it from my phone. So did the excavations work and analysis tell us more about the different type of people, features, age, build of people that lived in caves and those that live on fortification sites? So he's looking at some of the analysis in terms of maybe human remains or anything that would add to the age or the type of people that were there through your work in the caves and in the hill forts.
Okay. There really isn't any difference between the people in the caves and the people in the fortifications. It's all the same people. But whenever I did excavations, I would always first talk to the village, who that was their Koro Makawa, and I would say, what do you want me to do if I find some human bone? And I'd always ask them before, because at least in my experience, we would always find some, because there are lots of burials, and even if I'm trying to avoid them, there was just little bits of bone. So I'd always ask them first, what do you want me to do? And let them decide, because sometimes they're like, it's okay if you just put it back, we're all right if you keep excavating. And other times they wanted me to stop. So I'd let them tell me what they wanted. I encountered human remains a lot. And I think it's because the tradition in the old days was, when you moved away from the yavu of your grandfathers, you still recognize that as your vu, and you would bury members of your family back there, on that yavu. And when I was trying to investigate the fortifications, I wanted to know how old the fortifications were. So I would excavate yavu, because people would construct the yavu, and that would give me a rough age for when did people live here, because they would build the yavu and use, they do their cooking inside their bure, and they'd have a little fire hearth inside. And so I would look for the charcoal from the fire hearth. So I'd know, when did someone live in this particular spot on top of this fortification. And then I would also dig under the stone walls and try to get charcoal from under the walls, so that I could actually date whether they had fortified it with a wall or something like that. So I would had those two things I was trying to figure out, is when did people live up here, and when did they actually build things up here? So in the course of those excavations, I would come across burials where people had put in a burial after they'd moved away from the yavu. Sometimes the burials were relatively recent, within the last 500 years, and then sometimes they were about almost 1,000 years old. With the stone walls and other things that were meant to be part of the fortifications, there were often pieces of bone just in the rubble. Like someone lost a tooth, just from an accident, or they had a cavity and they pulled their tooth out, and it would just be mixed in with the dirt and the rocks. And so that wouldn't be a burial, it would just be a lost tooth. The people, a colleague of mine and I took a few bone samples that we had and analyzed the bone material for what are called stable isotopes. And basically these are elements of carbon and nitrogen that you have in your body just based on what you eat. And if you eat a lot of marine foods, then you have an elevated carbon signature. If you eat a lot of agricultural foods like dalo, you have an elevated nitrogen signature. I think that's right. So the people who lived in the Sigatoka Valley had diets that were predominantly agricultural products. So all we know is that they didn't live at the ocean, they lived in the valley, and they probably consumed their garden foods that were there. And we also did the same isotopic analysis of pigs, because people feed pigs, they keep them in the pen, or they keep them tied, and you feed them, to make them big. And pigs eat pretty much the same things that people do. And so the pigs were also eating the same garden products. And so that kind of shows you that people are living in that area. They have their garden, they're feeding themselves, and they're feeding their pigs at the garden as well. So they're not moving around. Everyone's settled, living what we would, identify as like a typical village life, where everyone is keeping those pigs for when you need them, because you need pigs for weddings and funerals, and you keep them alive until it's time. It's time to eat them, so you just keep feeding them until it's time. And so people were feeding those pigs and keeping them. So the people, diet wise, throughout time seem to have been farmers. And I don't have any other analysis of like their DNA or anything like that, because I haven't done that kind of work. The only other thing that was, related to burials, one of the large mounds on the top of the fortification called Noko Noko. That one's just north of Sigatoka town. There's a very large mound on the top of there. And the village Nanduri let me do an excavation on the side of the mound, not right on the top, but on the side. And that excavation came down on the burial of a woman who was laying on her side. And I think she might have been one of the wives of the chief that was buried under that mound. And she didn't look like she was, from her skeleton, she didn't look to be a very old person. So she could have passed away, but I wondered if she might have been one of the wives that was strangled when her husband passed. And it seemed like that was a possibility. And so, she seemed like a healthy woman otherwise. So it may be that, that tradition of either cutting off your finger when someone dies, or the wives being strangled and dying with the husbands, that probably occurred in, not that long ago. And there's definitely, I would suggest, some archaeological evidence for it. Yeah. So, but it's still the same people. The Fijians are still the Fijians, and there aren't any giants. There's not any leka leka. They're just Fijian people.
Okay, oh, that's good to know. Oh, wow. Look at that. Yeah. I think that answers that question from Masta. Yeah, so that was a really good question. And I think his last question that he asked here is, I think it's going to radiocarbon dating. In your research, was there any radiocarbon date evidence from the excavation work that may reveal the estimated total number of people occupying each old village site?
That one's hard because
the
radiocarbon dating tells you how old something is.
Right.
So a piece of charcoal from a fireplace, when you take that piece of charcoal and submit it for radiocarbon dating, what you're actually determining is when the tree died. And the tree probably died when it was cut down and then burned in the fire. But of course, in the old days, and still today, people go collect firewood, and you go find dead wood and you pick it up and you carry it home. And people complaining all the time, I have to go get more firewood because we just burned up all the stuff. And so the wood that's buried inside the yavu is the result of all of that firewood collection. So you can figure out how long ago a woman went and collected firewood and burned it to make dinner. And you can then use that to figure out when were they living there. And radiocarbon dating gives you how many years ago something happened within a time frame. You can't really determine how many people were living in the yavu or living on the village, just because of the age. So you could count the number of yavu and come up with an estimate of this would be like the maximum number of people that could have been sleeping. You could expect there maybe were 5 people sleeping in each of these. You could make a maximum population, but like any village today, there are yavu in modern villages with no house on top. And so that, archaeologically, they all look the same. They all look, you see them all. Some may be really old and some may not be so old. And it's hard to figure out how many people lived at any one time. Not easy to do. So you could figure out a maximum, but that population probably fluctuated. And with the fortifications, I'm sure people came and went, and they probably kept those fortifications. They maintained them. There were always the grandparents and other people that would stay there, but people would come and go to the gardens and go travel around. And so I'm sure the population sort of came and went a little bit, and there wasn't really a time that would be a particular representative time for the average. I think that would be hard to pin down. But the villages today, the populations of the Sigatoka Valley today they could be quite similar to what they were in the past. It's just that people moved around a lot, and they talk about that. They went from one fortification to the next, and they probably would have kept that up, and kept using the fortifications, and there's a lot of garden land around the fortifications that people still use, and they'll walk all the way out there and use that land because someone cleared it a long time ago, and it still is the garden land. So, yeah, so the populations probably were equivalent to what they are now.
What they are now. And then in terms of the radiocarbon dating, you have laboratories that after your work you send the samples over to these labs for analysis?
I do. Before I do that, I send it to a specialist in botany who looks at the charcoal and tells me what the plant is. And that's because I want to make sure I'm sending a piece of charcoal from a plant that's not a very long-lived plant. So better to send something from a small bush or a shrub than a tree that could live for 800 years. Because, if today you go and pick up a piece of wood from a very old tree, that piece of wood may have been hanging around for quite a while.
Wow.
And so you're dating the death of the tree. So I try to identify the charcoal and figure out what the plant is, and then date, which one seems the best. So from the excavations in the last few years, we identified sandalwood. The wood that was burned inside Nahea Cave was sandalwood. Yeah, and the other one was a tree called, I've forgotten it now. I want to say it's a yasa. I've forgotten what it is. It's a local tree.
Not Vasa? Vasa? No?
No, I've forgotten it now. I can email it to you.
Okay.
Yeah,
But Yasi, wow, the sandalwood.
Sandalwood. Yo.
Wow.
Yeah, and sandalwood's not that common now.
No.
I know. Oh, that's another thing I wanted to talk about. Palm. One of my favorite topics. So also meeting Dick Watling. Dick Watling has written a book about palm trees.
Yes.
So Fiji used to have all different kinds of palm trees, and they're not very common anymore because invasive trees have replaced them, like that African tulip tree.
Yes.
When the first Fijians arrived in Fiji, there's the hardwood forest like noko noko, and there's lots of other hardwoods, but a lot of the forests were palm. And they weren't necessarily the coconut kind of palm tree. They made a little nut. And if you go to the botanical gardens at USP, or you go to that one by the Garden of the Sleeping Giant, by Nundy, and then Dick Watling has a small farm up in Sigatoka where he's planted a lot of palm. The birds that were more common in Fiji used to eat those palm nuts, and now that there's fewer of the palm trees, it's harder for the birds to survive. And so when we did some cores where we put in these sediment cores that went down into the ground, just a little bit east of Sigatoka town. There's a big valley there that's got a lot of sediment in it. It's called Olo Olo. And we put in a core at Olo Olo that went down 6 meters. It went 6 meters down into the ground with sediment. At the bottom of the 6 meters, we went through a palm log. There's a palm tree way down at the bottom. Yeah. So, and that dated to about 6,000 years ago. So there were a lot more palms. And as people arrived in Fiji and started to garden, there's erosion that has filled in the lower parts of the land and filled it in really deep. And so, when we're out there trying to find lapita or things that are after that, on the beach, yes, you can find them, but inland, they're probably deeply buried underneath sediment that has come down off the hills and covered them. And I wouldn't be surprised if stuff is 4 or 5 meters down. So, you know, if we're worried that all the hotels have like been built on top of lapita sites, yes, but they're way down there. So we might find them someday.
Wow.
Might still find them someday.
Man, that's a very good point there, Dr. Julie. Yeah, about palm trees. See, so there you go. Anyone who's listening in, if you're thinking of a research topic, maybe it's about time they talk to Dr. Dick Watling and look at doing some research about ancient palm trees in Fiji. I want to quickly go back to the yasi. You know, and the use of it in caves. What do you think would they be used for? Do you have any idea?
So it was charcoal that was in the lovo.
Oh.
So they must have just used it for burning, or for light.
Because the yasi has got a beautiful incense. The smell as well. It's beautiful.
I mean, it could have been for something, you know, special like that for the smell, but it was in the lovo, so you know, maybe they wanted the food to smell nice. I don't know. Yeah, I know, but yeah, I was surprised to find sandalwood. I really was. Yeah.
Wow, that'll be another interesting kind of research because, you know, for us, we often use yasi. I mean, even we, for during weddings, you know, the yasi is often put on the heads of the bride and the groom. You know, yasi is often, I think, I'm sure some of our listeners may add some use of yasi back in the day. And then, of course, with the sandalwood trading, that happened in the 1800s, you know, they kind of take, you know, as many as they, you know, they wanted to sell at that time because of the demand from Asia, right? Yeah, because it happens here too in Hawaii. I'm sure you know more than I do, you know, on the way to Kona up in the Mauna Kea region, I found out that they had so much sandalwood trees, but there was a huge demand at that time, so they just cut most of them for trading.
They were worth a lot of money. So they all went to China and were carved into chests. I know. All the beautiful sandalwood forests of Fiji. Can you imagine how they must have smelled so glorious? They should replant them. They should.
Yes.
Start working on it. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I think I've spoken to maybe at least just 3 people that I know of. Maybe there would be more, but 3 of those I know are now going back into planting yasi because I know it takes a long time for it to mature. Yeah. And so what's that?
You plant it for your grandchildren.
Right. So it'll be like an investment, investment or a retirement project. So one of my friends who's living in California, she has been planting yasi for, I think for the last five years, I think, if I recall talking to her. So maybe between 5 and 10. So I'll just try and find out because she said that she's planning to return to Fiji when it's matured. So I think she's got a long-term plan. So that's amazing.
That's awesome. I'm really happy to hear that.
Oh, wow. I think we've covered majority of the questions that Master Bereniki Nalio asked online. And yeah, we still have about 100 plus people watching still on our session here. Vinaka Vakelevu, Bula Vinaka everybody. And I hope you are enjoying listening to our Talanoa. So if I may have missed your questions, just be reminded that this is not the last time you'll see Dr. Julie. Maybe we'll plan another Talanoa sometime next month or March when you have some free time.
I enjoy it very much.
Yes. So before we conclude our Talanoa, is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners before we finish our Talanoa?
Just vinakwa to everyone for joining in. I wish we were meeting tomorrow and we could say ngwata.
Oh, that is so nice. You still remember the Nadroga dialect?
That word. Ngwata. One of the best words.
Yeah. Oh, and since you mentioned Ngwata, I'm going to announce it to the listeners, but maybe I should share it with you because it's a special news. Because Dr. Paul Garrity is keen to join us next weekend to talk about the Nadroga dialect.
Oh, I'd love to see him.
Yeah. And so when I confirm the time, maybe I should do a same time like this with him, so you can watch from Ohio. Will that be okay?
I would love that. I would.
Okay. So he will be our guest next weekend. So I think some of our listeners are watching now. I was going to announce it later on in my later afternoon live, but I thought I'll share it with you since you've been so wonderful in Talanoa today.
Yeah, Vinaka Tarisi. Yeah, I will join you.
Yay! So Vinaka Vakalevu to you, Dr. Julie, and Vinaka to all our listeners. Thank you so much for listening into such an huge enlightenment that you've done for us, my sister, for you sharing your excavations in all those different places that you have written about, but you chose to Talanoa about it, which is so wonderful. And I'm sure our listeners are just as equally, excited and so happy to hear all the adventures that you took, digging in the dark, walking through those guanos. And all those uncomfortable, times that we spend in those caves. But at the end of it all, you are contributing so much to the understanding of Fiji's prehistory, but in this case, for the Sigatoka Valley.
Vinaka Tarisi. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, Vinaka, everybody. Vinaka Vakalevu, my sister, and then I will see you online when we'll plan to have a Talanoa again. But don't forget to join us next Sunday when Dr. Paul Garrity will be joining in.
Okay, I will. See you.
Okay. Vinaka Vakalevu,
Mode manda.
Naka,